She thought it was just another rusted shell buried deep in the woods, a forgotten 1969 Ford Mustang, abandoned and eaten by time. But when mechanic June Whitaker wiped the dirt from its windshield and found the VIN number, she had no idea it would unravel a decades-old military mystery. One tied to a fallen soldier, a government cover-up, and a secret someone tried to erase. What she discovered wasn't just a car, it was a voice from the grave. A 1969 Ford Mustang that carried more than horsepower, it carried history. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The silence in June Whitaker's world wasn't just emotional, it was mechanical. The clanking tools in her empty garage, once a symphony, now echoed like questions with no answers. At 31, June was a skilled mechanic, born with oil on her fingers and a knack for coaxing life out of dying engines. But small-town garages don't survive long when the factory down the road shuts down. Work had dried up, and bills piled like rust on a forgotten frame. She'd taken to combing the outskirts of the forest near Blue Ridge, North Carolina, picking up scrap metal, old wire, rusted farm tools. It wasn't prideful work, but it fed her. That day, it was her dog Ranger, a golden retriever with more heart than sense, who veered off the trail. He stopped, tail frozen, ears perked, and that's when June saw it. Half buried under brush and vine, a shape rose from the earth like a sleeping relic. She brushed back the leaves and gasped. A 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. Red, faded, scarred, but intact. She ran her hand across the rusted hood, then spotted the VIN plate. She didn't know it yet, but those numbers would open a door to a fallen soldier's legacy, and a story waiting 50 years to be told. June stood frozen for a long moment, her hand still resting on the rusted hood of the Mustang. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, painting everything in gold and shadow. It didn't feel like she'd just found a car. It felt like she'd unearthed a memory that didn't belong to her. The car was embedded in the forest floor, half sunk into the earth like it had been waiting. The vines weren't just growing around it, they were holding it. It took her nearly an hour, with Ranger nosing at her elbow, to clear the debris from the windshield and find the VIN plate. She wiped it clean with the edge of her shirt. 9F402R on 12062. She didn't know why, but she wrote it down in her notebook right then. Mechanics didn't get sentimental. They got curious. And something about this Mustang made her very curious. That night, with a mug of instant coffee in her hand and her phone screen cracked but working, she punched the VIN into every classic car registry she could find. Most came up blank, but one hit. The car had been registered in 1969 to a Staff Sergeant Owen Caleb Monroe. U.S. Army. Last documented location: Fort Benning, Georgia. The registration was never renewed. Monroe had been declared missing in action in Vietnam 6 months after that. And that was it. No transfer of ownership, no sale, no theft report, just nothing. June leaned back in her chair, heart thudding. Ranger let out a soft whine and rested his head on her boot. She closed her eyes. The pieces didn't make sense. Why was the car here, in a forest 300 miles from the base where it was last seen? Why was it buried hidden instead of junked or sold? And why did it feel like it was meant to be found? The next morning, she returned with tools, bolt cutters, a winch, a crowbar, and a mechanic's instinct honed through years of sweat and stubbornness. The forest was still wet with dew when she got back to the gully. Her boots sank into the soft soil. Birds called overhead. She got the hood open first, The engine was still there, dusty, corroded, but whole. A 428 Cobra jet. A monster of its time. She chuckled under her breath. Of course it is. But what made her heart skip wasn't the engine. It was the sealed military ammo box tucked into the back seat, bolted down. She stared at it for a long time before reaching out. It was standard issue, government green, welded shut along every seam, no markings, no lock, and no way it should have been in a civilian car. Her hands trembled slightly as she pried at the edge. It didn't open, not without tools and time. So she did the next best thing. She unbolted it, brought it home, and laid it on her garage workbench beneath the flickering shop light. The grinder's scream shattered the silence of the evening. Sparks flew like fireflies. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut through the welds, and when she finally cracked it open, she half expected weapons or money. But it was a book, wrapped in oilcloth, leather-bound, old, but meticulously kept. June sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of something far heavier than steel. She opened to the first page. Property of SSG Owen C. Monroe, U.S. Arts Army. What followed were dozens of pages of neat, blocky handwriting, field notes, coordinates, names. But the tone changed. Midway grew paranoid, messy, urgent. He wrote of a private contractor, Meridian Logistics, tasked with moving decommissioned military vehicles. He wrote about fuel invoices that never matched, parts that disappeared, paper trails that led nowhere, and eventually, the suspicion that money was being laundered through dead soldiers and stolen gear. And then they know I'm onto it. I hid the ledgers, I hid the car. I don't know if I'll make it out. But if you find this, don't trust the brass. Don't go through channels. They're compromised. I had to bury the proof. It's in the car, underneath it, bolted into the frame. June's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Ranger. The dog stared back at her, silent and watchful. This wasn't about a car anymore. It was a story someone tried to erase, and somehow, by poverty, chance, or fate, she'd become its witness. June didn't sleep that night. The journal lay on her kitchen table, its pages smoothed flat beneath a half-drunk cup of coffee. The words felt too heavy for one person to carry. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't an investigator. She was a mechanic, a woman trying to scrape together enough cash to keep her lights on. And yet, somehow, this had landed in her lap. No, it had found her. The next morning, she returned to the gully, a shovel in one hand, her tool bag in the other. Ranger trotted beside her, nose twitching, tail low. She was sure now the Mustang hadn't been dumped. It had been buried, hidden with purpose. June slid underneath the car, breath fogging in the morning chill. Rust flaked off the undercarriage as she worked. It was there, barely visible through grime and dirt, a false panel, bolted into the frame, near the rear axle. She worked in silence, only the creak of metal and the soft shift of dirt breaking the stillness. When the final bolt came loose, the panel dropped with a dull thud. Inside was a watertight steel box, smaller than a toolbox, heavier than it looked. Back in her garage, she opened it with trembling fingers. What she found wasn't cash, or gold, or weapons. It was worse. Original military ledgers, signed, stamped, unaltered. Page after page of falsified shipments. Routine equipment transfer. Fort Benning to Meridian Logistics. The numbers didn't match. Thousands of gallons of fuel for trucks that never existed. Parts for vehicles that had already been decommissioned. And then the kicker, a list of names. Soldiers marked MIA, including Owen Caleb Monroe, all of them linked to specific transfers. All of them vanished. At the bottom of the box, nestled between two envelopes, was a cassette tape. June stared at it like it might burn her fingers. On the label Play, only if you trust no one. She didn't even own a tape player anymore, but her grandfather had kept an old boombox in the attic. She dug it out, dusted it off, popped in the cassette. A man's voice, hoarse and southern, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it. Name's Staff Sergeant Owen Monroe, U.S. Army. What you're holding is proof, real proof, that the wrong people got too much power and no one stopped them. Meridian wasn't just a logistics firm. They were moving more than hardware. They were burying ghosts." He paused. The silence stretched. "I found out too much. So they made me disappear. This car. This journal. It's the only thing I had left. I hid it far from base. Deep in the woods. They'll never find it unless someone's meant to. If you're meant to. I'm sorry." The tape clicked off. Nothing else. June sat there in silence, the weight of the room pressing down on her. She felt like she'd stepped into a story that had already ended, but someone forgot to close the book. Later that day, she drove to the local library, hands shaking as she scanned microfilm records from 1969. It took her 3 hours to find it, a small article buried in the back pages. "Local soldier missing in action. Staff Sergeant Owen C. Monroe." One paragraph, one photo. A young man with deep-set eyes and a crooked grin. Beloved son of Ada and Walter Monroe. Declared missing after helicopter went down outside Quang Tri Province. Vietnam. Presumed deceased. Body not recovered. June traced her fingers across the faded image. He never came home. But his car did. The weight of it all pressed in on her. Someone had buried the truth. And now, half a century later, it had clawed its way to the surface in her garage. She didn't know what she was going to do with the ledgers, the journal, or the tape. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Someone out there didn't want this story told. And if they found out she had it, they'd come looking. That night, a car she didn't recognize drove slowly past her house. It didn't stop, didn't honk, just watched. Ranger growled from the porch. And June, for the first time, felt afraid. Not for herself, but for the truth, and what it might cost to tell it. That night, June didn't sleep. She sat in her garage, surrounded by open boxes and scattered pages, the tape recorder still sitting silent beside her like a relic of confession. She kept staring at the photo of Owen Monroe in the article she'd found. That crooked grin, that spark of youth, spark. He had died with secrets, but he hadn't meant for them to die with him. He buried them for someone to find. And now that someone was her, the next morning, she tried to go about her usual routine, check the mail, sweep the porch, sip lukewarm coffee, but the world no longer felt solid. The truth had cracked the foundation of her quiet life. As she drove into town for groceries, she noticed the same black sedan parked across from the diner. 2 men inside, dark suits, staring straight ahead, pretending not to notice her. They weren't pretending very well. June's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Her heart thudded with quiet rage, not fear, whoever they were. They weren't just here to observe. They were here to silence. She thought about going to the police. But Monroe's journal had warned her, don't trust official channels. She couldn't unsee what she saw. Couldn't unlearn what she'd read. Couldn't unknow that ledger of names, the names of men who had served their country and disappeared into thin air, buried beneath paperwork and polite press releases. That evening, she drove out to the only place she knew she could think her grandfather's old property near the ridge, the one with the hunting cabin, long abandoned and barely standing. No power, no signal, no one around. She brought the journal with her, and the tape, and the ledgers. She sat on the sagging steps of the porch and looked out at the tree line, the sun dipping low and orange through the leaves. Her grandfather used to say that truth was like an old engine. It sputters, stalls, and kicks back. But if you're patient and you know where to look, it always turns over. She understood what he meant now. For most of her life, June had believed stories like this belonged to other people. Men with medals, women in suits, soldiers, senators, journalists. Not mechanics. Not girls who grew up under the hood of a pickup truck and paid their bills by rebuilding carburetors. But the Mustang had found her. The journal had found her. He had found her. Not by chance, by faith. Monroe had trusted the unknown. Trusted that someday, somehow, the right person would open that box. Someone who would give a damn. Someone who would care enough to finish what he started. June stared down at her hands, grease-stained, rough, steady. Maybe that person was her. Back at the house, she began scanning everything. She uploaded copies of the journal. The ledgers. She made backups, one on a flash drive she hid in her old toolbox, another on an encrypted cloud account. She even printed out the key pages and wrapped them in plastic, buried them in a coffee can behind her shed. If they came for her, they wouldn't find silence. They'd find proof. The next night, the sedan was back, parked closer this time. Still, waiting. She didn't look out the window, didn't flinch. She just sat at her workbench, turning a rusted bolt between her fingers. Ranger resting at her feet like a sentry carved from muscle and bone. June Whitaker was no longer afraid. Something had shifted inside her. She wasn't just fixing a car anymore. She was resurrecting a soldier's name. She was restoring a stolen truth. She was preparing for a fight. And when they finally came knocking, she'd be ready. It started with a name. June sat cross-legged on the garage floor. Monroe's ledger open beside her, her laptop humming quietly. The men listed in those pages, they weren't just numbers, they were real. She typed each name into public record sites, old military reunion boards, missing veterans forums. Most were dead or declared missing. But one name lit up, Frank Delaney, retired. S. Army, survived 2 tours in Vietnam. Last known location, Hickory, North Carolina. It was only 2 hours away. She stared at the screen, heart thudding. Delaney's name had been mentioned in Monroe's journal. Only guy left I trust. There was a note next to it. Knew about Meridian. Still got copies. That was enough. The next morning, June packed her bag flash drive, scanned documents, Monroe's journal, and Ranger, who refused to let her leave without him. The Mustang was still half buried, unreachable for now, but her old Chevy truck still ran like a dream. She left a note on her fridge: if I don't come back, tell the truth, it's all in the toolbox. She meant it. Frank Delaney lived in a modest brick home tucked behind a rusted mailbox and 2 retired flagpoles. He opened the door wearing a flannel shirt and a look that said he wasn't used to visitors. June held up Monroe's journal like a badge. I think you knew him. He squinted, took the book with hands that shook slightly. When he read the name inside, his face changed. Everything in him slowed. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. June stepped forward. I found his car, a '69 Mustang buried in the forest near Blue Ridge. Inside was that journal, the ledgers, a tape. Frank didn't say a word for a long time. He just stood there, staring down at the journal like it was a ghost that had finally come home. They sat on his porch for 2 hours. He told her stories about Monroe, about the Meridian contract, about how supplies would vanish, how paperwork would be signed under pressure. We all knew something was off, he said, but Owen, he went deeper. He tracked every bolt, every gallon, every missing man. Frank had tried to help, but then Monroe disappeared, officially MIA. But everyone knew. His death was a warning, Frank said, that if we poked too hard, we'd vanish too. June handed him the ledgers, the scanned copies, the tape. Frank's hands trembled as he opened them, years of buried guilt and silence pouring into his eyes. "This is it," he said. "This is what he died for." Together, they called in a favor Frank's old contact in Washington, a retired colonel turned whistleblower advocate, a man who owed Monroe his life. And just like that, the door cracked open. A network. Not official, not polished, but real. Veterans, journalists, archivists, men and women who had seen too much, lost too much, and waited too long for someone to give them a reason to speak up. They didn't need proof. June had already brought it. What they needed was courage, and she had more of that than she'd ever realized. A week later, a meeting was arranged. Underground, off the books. No names, no photos, just June, Frank, and 5 others around a folding table in the back of a veterans' hall. They listened to the tape. They read Monroe's words. They saw the ledgers, the forged reports, the trail of cover-ups that led all the way to the upper echelons of defense contracting. When the room fell silent, one man whispered, "He never stopped fighting, did he?" June shook her head. "No. But they buried him before he could finish." The oldest man in the room, a former Army intel officer with tears in his eyes, looked her straight in the face. "Then I guess it's our turn now." That night, June returned home to find the black sedan gone. She didn't relax. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just her burden anymore. It was becoming a movement, a reckoning, a mission passed from a fallen soldier to a mechanic who wasn't supposed to matter, but did. She looked at Ranger, who wagged his tail without moving from his spot at the door. "We're not alone anymore, buddy." And they weren't. They had truth. They had allies. And most importantly, they had momentum. The old June Whitaker would have stayed quiet, would have fixed the car, returned to work, and tried to forget that a soldier's voice had once echoed through her garage speakers. But that June was gone now. The woman who stood in her place didn't just know the truth, she carried it, like a tool belt slung across her hips, heavy and necessary. And she had work to do. Her garage became more than a place for engines. It became her war room. The walls were lined with printouts, maps, names. The Mustang still sat on the trailer in the back lot, now fully excavated, its faded red paint washed clean of leaves and mud. She hadn't repaired it yet. Somehow. It felt sacred, untouched, like a memorial. She'd started recording everything: video logs, scanned documents, audio backups. She even sat in front of a cheap camera and told Monroe's story in her own words. Tears brimming, but never falling. "I didn't know him," she said, voice low and steady. "But I know what he stood for, and I'm not going to let them erase that." She wasn't hiding anymore. The threats came faster than she expected. Anonymous emails, strange calls in the middle of the night. One morning, she found the bolts on her trailer loosened. Someone wanted the Mustang gone. She bought security cameras, reinforced the locks, kept her shotgun closer than she'd ever thought she would. But fear wasn't enough to stop her now. Each threat only proved she was getting closer. Then the media picked it up. It started as a rumor, a local mechanic claiming she'd found evidence of military fraud buried in a classic car. A fringe blog picked it up. Then a veteran-run YouTube channel, Then everything exploded. Journalists started calling, some genuine, some vultures. She ignored the ones chasing headlines. But a retired investigative reporter from The Atlantic, a woman named Marjorie Sloan, reached out and asked to meet face to face. June agreed. They met in the back booth of a truck stop diner, over bitter coffee and soggy toast. June laid everything on the table, Monroe's journal, the ledgers, the tape. Sloan listened without interrupting, her pen barely moving. When June finished, the reporter leaned back and said only one thing. "You ready for what comes next?" June nodded. "I have to be." The article hit the web 3 weeks later. Buried steel, the mechanic, the Mustang, and the soldier America forgot. It was raw, personal, and damning. By the next morning, June's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She turned most of it off, kept only a prepaid line for those who mattered. But what mattered most weren't the headlines. It was the letters. Hundreds of them. From families who had lost someone to paperwork, from mechanics, veterans, survivors, from people who had never spoken up until now. One note simply read, "Thank you for digging him out. I think you saved more than just a name." June stood taller now, spoke firmer, smiled less but felt more. The pain hadn't gone. The fear hadn't vanished. But something else had taken its place. Purpose. She had taken a story meant to be buried and brought it back into the light. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for truth, for justice, for Owen Monroe, who never made it home, and for all the others who were still waiting, sometimes late at night. She'd sit beside the Mustang, Ranger curled at her feet. She'd run her hand over the faded hood and whisper, "We're getting there. And maybe, somewhere beyond the veil, the man who once drove this car could hear her. Maybe he knew that his story hadn't died in a jungle or in a dusty ledger. It lived on in a garage, in a woman who refused to be silent, and in a Mustang that still, somehow, felt like it was just waiting for the key to turn." It wasn't the headlines that changed everything. It wasn't the interviews, or even the congressional inquiry that followed. It was the ceremony. 6 months after the article went viral, June Whitaker stood in the back of a quiet chapel in Arlington, her work boots polished, her hands clenched at her sides. At the front of the room stood a folded American flag on a wooden table. A photograph rested beside it, faded, black and white, of a young soldier with a crooked smile and eyes too old for his age. Staff Sergeant Owen Caleb Monroe, missing in action for over 5 decades. Finally. Recognized. Finally. Remembered. A general in full-dress uniform stepped to the podium. He spoke about service, about sacrifice, about truth delayed but never destroyed. He read from Monroe's journal his final words, etched in fear but wrapped in courage. June stood still, the words washing over her like rain. She didn't cry. Not yet. When the ceremony ended, the general approached her directly, saluted, and said, "Because of you, ma'am. He came home." June only managed a nod. Her throat was tight. Too tight for words. The general handed her the folded flag. His mother passed in 1982, he added gently. "There's no one left. No family to receive it." June looked down at the flag in her hands, triangle folded. Heavy. Sacred. "I'll keep it," she whispered. "He deserves that much." Back home in Blue Ridge, spring had come. The trees wore new leaves. The wind smelled of pine and warm dirt. The Mustang now sat in the center of her garage. Fully restored, not showroom perfect, but honest. Its paint shined a little redder. The chrome trim gleamed. The engine purred like it had been waiting 50 years for a second chance. On the dash sat Monroe's dog tag, framed beneath the VIN plate, and above the workbench, the flag. Framed, protected, home. Life didn't get easier. The world didn't magically heal. But something had changed. People came to visit not out of curiosity, but reverence. Veterans, journalists, students. They asked to see the car, the journal, to hear the story not from the news, but from her lips. And June told it, every time, truthfully, carefully, like she was handing off a torch. Because she was... One Saturday morning, she found a letter in her mailbox. No return address, just her name. Handwritten. Inside was a photo. 4 soldiers, leaning against a jeep, all grinning like fools. Monroe was one of them. On the back, someone had written, "We didn't all disappear. You gave one of us his name back. That means more than you know." June stood on her porch for a long time, the photo clutched in her hands, her heart full. Not of sorrow, not of fear, but of something quieter, stronger, peace. That night, she took the Mustang out on the open road for the first time. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The engine growled as the car climbed the ridgeline, headlights carving through the dusk. At the top of the hill, June parked and stepped out. She looked up at the stars. "I hope you see this, Owen," she said softly. "I hope you know. We didn't let them win." The wind picked up, rustling the trees like an answer. And in that moment, surrounded by the hush of the hills and the pulse of a restored engine beneath her feet, June Whitaker didn't feel like a mechanic. She felt like a soldier, carrying forward a legacy not written in medals or parades, but in truth, courage, and a car that was never just a car. A week after the ceremony at Arlington, June returned home to a mailbox overflowing with letters, her voicemail blinking red with calls from strangers who called her brave, and a few who called her a problem. That night, the black SUV came back, but this time it didn't drive past. It stopped, parked at the edge of her property. Ranger growled low, pacing behind the screen door. June didn't hide. She stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed, boots planted. 2 men got out. Not in suits this time, not pretending to be polite. They looked tired, angry, desperate. One of them spoke. "You don't know what you've started." June's voice was calm. "No, I know exactly what I've started." The man laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You think this ends with a flag and a headline? You think this is justice?" "No," she said. "Justice is what comes next." There was a pause, a beat of silence, then headlights in the distance, 3 vehicles, unmarked, quiet, but organized. Veterans, federal investigators, people who had been watching the watchers. The SUV men looked back, realizing, for the first time, they weren't in control anymore. "We'll disappear," one of them hissed. "Just like the last time?" June stepped forward. "Maybe," she said, her voice steel. "But this time, we're keeping the records. This time, people are watching." They didn't argue. They got in the SUV, and they left. She stood there long after they were gone. The road silent again. The night wind soft through the trees. But something had shifted. They weren't hunting her anymore. They were running. Anyone can uncover truth if they're brave enough to dig, and stubborn enough not to look away. As dusk settled over the quiet hills of Blue Ridge, June Whitaker didn't turn the key of the Mustang to drive away from the past. She turned it to carry it forward. The journal she once opened in fear was now preserved in a glass case beside a flag, not for display, but for legacy. And the garage where secrets were once hidden had become a place where names were spoken again, out loud, with honor. The mechanic who once doubted her worth had become the keeper of a soldier's story, and the voice for every truth that someone tried to bury. Because for June and for all of us, the truth is never the end. It's where everything begins. The end? Up next, 2 more unforgettable stories are waiting for you. Click to keep uncovering the hidden heroes among us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some stories deserve to be told, no matter how long they've been buried.